From Amsterdam, this is Bright Minds, the podcast from the John Adams Institute, a treasure trove of the best and the brightest of American thinking. I'm Jonathan Gruber. Forbes called today's guest one of the 100 most powerful women in the world, Christiane Amanpour. In fact, when she was asked if being a female reporter was an advantage or disadvantage, this was her answer.
Yeah, I would say it's always an advantage.
Always.
It's never been a disadvantage. Reporting while female is a route to success, in my view. You know, the first Gulf War was when I did my first big story, and I got a lot of publicity and attention because I was a woman.
And Christiane Amanpour got a lot of attention here in Amsterdam back on January 25th, 2019, when CNN's chief international anchor and the host of Amanpour joined the Dutch journalist Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal for what turned out to be a witty, revealing, and thoughtful conversation about the state of modern journalism. They covered topics like putting humanity into the news and the current journalistic moment. But for this podcast, we're also focusing on their discussion about the role of objectivity versus truth. Ms. Amanpour's journalistic philosophy gelled in a place that forced many to confront their sense of morality and their devotion to the truth, the war in Bosnia in the 1990s. And so Mr. Rosenthal started this part of the talk by projecting a picture of a graveyard.
This is now many years after the war, and it's a beautiful graveyard. When I was covering it in the early 90s, that was the main area in Sarajevo, and there was no time to put up beautiful marble headstones and marble graves. It was just dig between the shelling and the sniping, sometimes bodies going on top of each other, graves being opened, more and more people put in, just little wooden emblems. They weren't crosses because most of these are Muslim, obviously, in Sarajevo. But I remember doing one of the most poignant stories I did during the war was about a little girl called Al-Medina. And I told the story of the war and the deprivation and the siege through her headstone, which wasn't a stone, it was a piece of wood. And the city had run out of the letter A and run out of the number for the year that she died. And so it was very poignant and very emotional just to tell that story like that. And it had a big impact on a lot of people. But I remember, for me, that's what that graveyard says. I always remind myself, it reminds me of that little girl, Al-Medina, but it also reminds me of the 1984 Olympics, because just near there was the ice skating rink where Torvill and Dean skated to gold medal to Bolero. And that ice skating rink, they turned into a graveyard, the outside of it, not the inside, and the soccer fields that were around it. So that's what I see when I see that.
With all the conflicts that you've covered, what place does the Bosnian War take in your memory? Because it's been important.
Yeah, it's more than important. It's been formative for me.
How is that?
It definitely, I believe it formed me as an adult. It formed me as a journalist. It formed me as a person. I will never ever, forget Bosnia, and I will never forget what I learned in Sarajevo. And I learned very, very key principles that have now I've been able to use going forward. For instance, the principle of truth, first and foremost, because I got myself into this situation where people started saying, she's siding with the Sarajevans. Right. Anyway, the long story is...
You said you were anti-Serb.
Yes.
Serbian.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely anti what they were doing.
Yeah.
And I told the story because what happened was, the truth of the story was that it was a multi-ethnic city, that everybody was intermarried, Croat, Serb, Muslim for generations. It was the home of the Jews, after the persecution and the Inquisition. Sarajevo the National Museum has one of the oldest Haggadahs in the world. It's the most beautiful. And it was there. So it was a really, 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 really multi-ethnic, tolerant city. And for whatever reason, part of the fall of the Eastern Bloc, the Serbs, who were the powerful ones there, because it was Belgrade and Yugoslavia, they had the army, they had, the politics, and, that was the center of Yugoslavia, was in Belgrade. And so when Serbia became Serbia, it was still had all the tools of the state. And they thought, well, you know what? We want a little more land. And we want to carve all this land out to just be ethnically pure white Christian Serbs. So you know how we're going to do it? We're going to besiege in a medieval fashion one of the most metropolitan cities in Europe, Sarajevo, and we're going to turn it into a medieval disaster zone. And we're going to sit, let's say, in the top rung there on the hills, and we're just going to keep bombing. And that's what they did for 4 years. Shelling, bombing, shooting, sniping. And of course, we were there. And we told that story. And that story was a desperately human story. And, you know, you talked about children who were shot, women who were shot, people just going to do, you know, ordinary things that they suddenly couldn't do. Collect food, collect wood because there was no heating, collect water because the water had been turned off, try to find something to make some light because there was no electricity. And they were just massacred and slaughtered. Added to that, the concentration camps, the whole scale ethnic cleansing, which now we know is genocide, because right here in The Hague, in the Netherlands, we had landmark cases, which I reported on, which have enshrined that it was a genocide. And what the problem was, world leaders didn't want to deal with it. They just didn't want to get involved. As we all know, there is a international requirement to combat genocide under the international law. And they didn't want to do it. So the more I did my stories, the more my colleagues did these stories about what was happening, trying to cleanse a territory in order to annex it. The more those who didn't want to intervene would say that we were lying or that we were siding with one side and it wasn't fair and oh this and oh that. So it was particularly difficult as a young journalist to figure out how to deal with that. And I ended up, after being accused of being pro-whatever, I don't know what I was, pro-life, no, in this case.
Right. Pro-truth.
Pro-truth.
I think I got a scoop.
And anti-genocide. I suddenly realized that I had to make a stand. So I said, look, you know, our golden rule is objectivity. The thing that is the golden rule for every journalist is objectivity. Now, objectivity means definitely telling all sides of the story, but it definitely does not mean drawing false equivalences and either moral or factual. So I wasn't going to say, well, this person is equal to that person. I wasn't going to equate the victim and the aggressor. And I think that in times of this kind of issue, if you are neutral instead of truthful, you are an accomplice. You're an accomplice.
Right.
You are an accomplice. And in this case, an accomplice to genocide. And I was not going to be an accomplice to genocide. So I learned there to tell the truth, no matter how difficult it was and no matter how unpopular it was. And that's why I found it very important.
But is there a fine line? We just saw Maduro, and you sat here and you basically said, you know, this guy should go, which is a fair statement.
People say it's not me.
Sorry?
It's hundreds of thousands of people on the street.
Right, but you
3 million people who run away from him.
Right, but you seem to agree with that statement.
I mean, after...
Is it something you would say on your show?
I wouldn't have said it so glibly, right? But I would have definitely, 100%. I've said it to him face to face.
Right, no, I bet, yeah.
Not that you should go, but don't you think you have a responsibility if you claim to be elected and representing the people? Yeah. No, I'm not like that. I don't fling my opinions around like that, but I do ask the pointed questions.
It's a trap for journalists, an objectivity trap, the false equivalency, you mean?
Yeah, it's a trap, and and we should be very mindful of it. We should recognize what it is we're seeing and what it is we're covering, and cover it truthfully. And I tell you, this business of having to be neutral, that's why we're in the state we're in with climate, because journalists have mistakenly believed that they owe it to the tiny percentage of liars and deniers to equate them with the massive, overwhelming evidence of science.
But is journalism winning in a sense? I mean, if you look at what Trump does, if you look at, so the special counsel will come out with a report, maybe in a few weeks, who knows? But he has called CNN and all the others fake news for so long now. No, Trump has, sorry. That no matter what Mueller eventually will come up with, his base won't believe it.
Right.
So you're completely right about objectivity, but is it a winning argument, or are the Bolsonaros and the Erdogans and the Orbans and the Trumps in a winning mood?
Well, I mean, you could say yes, you could, and that's a very depressing thing to say. The very depressing thing is that Duterte in Philippines, or Orban in Hungary, or as you said, Erdogan and the others, they have no incentive to like a free press or to respect a free press. It's just not in their bones. It's not in their blood. It's not in their DNA.
Right.
You kind of expect authoritarians who are not nurtured in the democratic world.
Trump is different.
Yeah. So that's what I'm coming to. My whole career has been working in countries that are run by people who don't respect a free press. So I'm used to that, and it's dangerous physically. Many of our colleagues have been wounded, not just because they were caught in the crossfire, but because people wanted to shut them up. In Russia, in many, many places, journalists are actually targeted. The Committee to Protect Journalists, which has its own sort of statistics, every year puts out statistics with the following sober line: the leading cause amongst journalists today is deliberate murder, which, as you know, is quite skewed from the leading cause of the general population, the leading cause of death. So this is a real problem. But what's 1,000 times worse, and what compounds this problem, is when the leader of the United States of America, the world's most developed democracy, says the same stuff, and therefore makes a even more permissive environment for these other non-democratic authoritarian leaders around the world. So that is a very, very big problem. And certainly the first year of Trump with the fake news thing, I think now everybody's a bit bored. People just kind of fake news. Okay, how many times can you say fake news? All right, we'll say it again. Okay. But I think at the beginning, certainly when I would go places, you'd hear people just being delighted to accuse us of fake news. Well, if the president of the United States says it, it must be true. And by the way, that's true. People actually truly believe that if the president of the United States says something, he must know something.
Which should be how it is.
Yeah, it should be.
With any other president.
But I was surprised about that. You always have these conspiracy theories all over the world. I thought that other leaders were using it as an excuse, but actually many people in many parts of the world believe what comes out of the White House podium and this and that. So, are they winning? I think they have had a very good run for a couple of years, but I think the tables will turn, and I think the tables are beginning to turn. The great thing about journalism is that, and we journalists, is that we have not surrendered, and we've not bent over, and we will not take it. Yeah.
There you go. This is...
so this is Israel during the 2006 war against Hezbollah.
Right. Peter Arnett, a well-known correspondent, foreign correspondent in the Vietnam War, Iran, Iraq, etc. For CNN, you must know him well. And he has said there are some stories that may be worth dying for. You just said, that your perspective was changed when your son was born. Are there stories worth dying for?
But it's just too hard a question to answer, because there's just too much pain and suffering for everybody around when one of us gets hurt or one of us gets killed. I would say that subconsciously or unconsciously, I probably thought that before my brain kicked in when I became a mother. But I mean, we obviously believed that in Bosnia. I mean, we were there for years and years and years under the bombing and the besiegement and the shelling and the actual targeting of journalists. Bosnia was the very first war where journalists were deliberately targeted. All the others before that, whether it was Vietnam or Middle East wars or Central America and all the rest of it, journalists were caught in the crossfire, or it was accidental. Bosnia was the first time. And part of that is where they targeted us. And part of that, and now, of course, it's de rigueur. we are targeted de rigueur by state actors, by non-state actors. It's a really terrible situation.
So Bosnia was the riskiest place.
Yeah, well, it was at that time the riskiest place, and we stayed and we stayed and we stayed, and we lost a lot of friends, a lot of friends.
In the Middle East, where you were working there, you being a female reporter, has that? I can foresee circumstances where it's an advantage, and maybe sometimes it's not. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I would say it's always an advantage.
Always.
Always. It's never been a disadvantage. Reporting while female is a route to success, in my view.
I'll think of that when my career evolves from here.
Well, you know, we live in a very fluid world.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Doctors can do a lot.
Seriously?
Yes.
Seriously. Okay, so I never thought there was something weird about being a woman, or that I was ever at any disadvantage. Yeah. Now, call me crazy, call my parents brilliant, but I was raised never to have thought that there was anything unavailable to me because I was a woman. So I thank my parents and my family for just that. Without ever indoctrinating me, it was just I was never told I can't do something because I'm a girl.
But not everybody you run into was raised by your parents.
No, but who gave a crap about them? I was doing my stuff. Right. And it was great. And I came up at a time when it was, the first Gulf War was when I first did my first big story, and I got a lot of publicity and attention because I was a woman. But that's when it became more and more visible, more and more women, and behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, everything. I think the big issue right now is that there are not enough women running news organizations. In fact, there aren't any women running any news organizations as far as I can gather, except for at CBS News now, the great Susan Zirinsky has been made president of the network, which is fantastic.
And is that obviously it's a problem, but do you also see it in programming? Is that what you mean?
No, because you see many women fronting programs. I think on the air, there's
choosing items, topics.
Yeah,
whatever.
I mean, I just think that. Yeah, I mean, look, the world is made up of 50% women and 50% men, and when men have 100% of the power, there's a problem. I mean, it's a skewed.
Look what
view.
happened, right?
Yeah.
So it's always, you're saying it's always been an advantage, and
yes, it has been for me
in making first contact with people,
yes,
or
first
anything.
Contact with people. I think probably because we do live in a patriarchal world still, so that often men will maybe think that they were not getting such a hard, deal when they saw a woman or whatever, or they would open the door for a woman. They're just usually nice to women,
right?
Usually.
Yeah.
If they're not nice, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So for me, it was like, okay, well, they're letting me go. They're opening the door. I'll put my foot in the door and I won't take it out. And that's what happened. That is.
You've been traveling. I read with all female crews.
As well, yeah. Actually, you're right. In some areas, let's say in the Muslim world or whatever, you can't actually go into the women's part of the home or whatever if you're a guy. So in that regard, being a woman was actually substantively advantageous.
Okay,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Let's go to the next photo, which is the Haiti earthquake in 2010, I believe. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. This is Haiti. Now, there were so many journalists there on the ground.
That's my old mate, David Rust. He's a great, great cameraman, and he's a great hoarder.
What does he hoard?
He could fill this theater and make a museum of all the things that he's collected from all the war zones, all the places we've been together. It would be the most brilliant CNN museum. Phenomenal.
So you've traveled with him to many places.
Yes, since 1992.
Right.
Yeah.
How important is that, by the way? I mean, traveling with your own crew.
It's great, actually. It's really great. We don't always do that. I mean, there's a big pool of people, but sometimes in some circumstances, we end up being the same people working together. And actually, it does. It's like a cohesive unit of brothers and sisters in service of the same end.
Now, the Haiti earthquake in 2010, which I covered myself, and there were hundreds of journalists there, and being CNN, you have to go live all the time. How do you pick your story? How do you realize this is what I want to focus on?
It's difficult, and it's not difficult. I mean, in a place like Haiti, I mean, you were there because there's so much need, there's so much catastrophe. And again, for me, telling the story is always trying to get to the human angle of the story. And I really was very, very concerned with the actors in the field on the ground, whether it's war or famine or whatever it is.
How do you feel about politicians?
Oh, that's a bit of a leading question.
No, I know but it doesn't sound like your favorite breed. I mean, it's not my favorite breed.
No, that's not true. In fact, what I think is a real problem is the lack of respect amongst society that politicians have these days. You know, it's politicians, it's journalists, it's, I don't know, we're all really right at the bottom of the pile of popularity. I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem. Right. And I think we have a duty, I think, not to just piss all over any politician just for the hell of it.
No. But you've seen the House of Commons, you've seen Brexit, you called Congress dysfunctional. I mean, some deserve
that's
it
today, now. But it doesn't mean to say it's all the time.
No, of course not. And not everyone.
And you've got to be able to look for those who are prepared to break with their party or to reach across the aisle. And I really try to promote and interview those people because I think it's really interesting and it's mature and but I think what I think is really sad is how in the democratic world, in the free world, the number of young people who vote, is just not high enough. And I think it's getting higher. I think in response to these cataclysmic political developments we've had since Brexit, the whole 2016 to 2019 has been a particular moment in history.
Yeah. And the midterms could make you optimistic when it comes to turnout.
That's right. But I think that if we're going to treat politicians like criminals, then we're not going to get good politicians and we're not going to get good policies. So I actually think it's a much more nuanced relationship that the press should have with politicians and with politics. Of course, we have to hold everybody accountable, but we also have to report on the good stuff and the success. If we constantly just report the bad stuff, it's not just that it's just a one note Johnny. We are contributing to the cynicism in society, to the lack of hope in society. And I genuinely believe that one of the big problems is a lack of hope and a lack of belief in the future. Because I think we humans, without hope, we're nothing. And I really, really do strongly, that's a huge part of my broadcasting and my reporting I'm looking for the hope. I'm looking for the reconciliation. I'm looking for the tolerance. I'm looking for the brave new policies. And that's what I want to focus on.
I want to end with a question about Europe, but that also brings me back to, we talked about the Bosnian War being one of the key moments in your career, maybe the key moment. It cemented your reputation. This thing happened only 40 years after World War II in Europe. For many of us, I guess it also underlined the need for a strong European Union. This should never happen again. Do these things, and maybe also the danger of nationalism, is this in the back of your mind when you're in the field reporting all the time? Because it seems that way
now. I mean, it's the motif and the backdrop for what we're reporting right now. Yeah, this ugly rise of populism, nationalism, which is all centered, a lot of it centered around hatred of foreigners. I think Europe, to be honest with you, failed on the great challenge of our time, which was the immigration crisis. And Europe did not...
the recent one, you mean?
From 2015.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I think that if Europe had been more willing to take their fair share and not letting all of them go to Germany or all of them try to come through Hungary and all that kind of stuff, I think maybe, this continent of 500 million people could have absorbed 1 million and nobody would have been any the wiser. But because it became such a fight, because it became such a thing, it destabilized so many countries, and it made craven politicians able to use that as a way to give rise to their populist politics. So I regret that. I regret that Europe wasn't able to deal with that properly. And then, of course, we're still suffering the effects of austerity in so many areas. And that's real people really hurting.
And if we end with an optimistic note.
Mm-hmm. Despite all of this.
Exactly.
Well, look, I think, as I say, I believe 2018 was one of the most difficult years in modern, certainly in my career. I mean politically and in every way, because it really did seem like the world was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and nobody quite knew how to deal with all this turbulence. I think it's sort of, to an extent, calming down. I think also where I get hope is from a backlash, whether it's against guns, whether it's against racial inequality, whether it's for women's rights. I think that has been one of the most important reactions to this reactionary force that we've been seeing. And I also think journalism has stood up. And I think the one thing I've learned, which maybe I didn't know, I thought that history went in a nice progressive line, but I realized that it doesn't. It's just circular. Mm-hmm. It's just circular. So if we can get through this, there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Perfect.
An optimistic note there, ending Christiane Amanpour's talk, led by the Dutch journalist Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal. Did you know that you can go to our website, john-adams.nl/videos, where there's a link to the video of this extraordinary event? We also have a newsletter you can sign up for and a veritable treasure trove of great American thinkers and speakers at john-adams.nl. And while you're there, why not become a member of the John Adams? Not only will you support what we do, you get a discount to future live events. In the meantime, you should go to wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review of this show. This will help get the word out, and we can keep on sharing the very best of American thinkers in Europe with you, free of charge. That's it for this week's show. Our theme song is called La Prensa by the Parlandos. Our editor is Tracy Metz. From Amsterdam, this was Bright Minds, the podcast from the John Adams Institute. I'm Jonathan Gruber. Thank you for listening.